Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Institute for Government event. I'm really delighted that today I'm going to be in conversation with Kat Little, who is the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary and COO of the Civil Service. Welcome to everyone who's joining us here in the room and to lots of people who registered to watch this event online. So it is a big week for the Civil Service. We've just heard that Sir Chris Wormold, who is currently Perm Secretary at the Department of Health and Social Care, is going to be the new Cabinet Secretary. And a plan for change will be announced later this week, building on a previous IFG recommendation for governments to set out more clearly their policy priorities so that those can be built into funding allocations at the spending review. So it's a particularly important time, we think, to be thinking about how the public sector can be oriented to deliver the government's aims. The Prime Minister said when appointing the new Cabinet Secretary that he wants a complete rewiring of the British state, and Kat will be at the forefront of those efforts. So I'm looking forward to a really wide-ranging discussion on the government's approach to public sector reform, the future of the civil service, and the role of the Cabinet Office, and more. Before we get going, I just want to say now, please do send in your questions. Anyone who wants to ask a question, whether you're in the room or online, can you please use the Slido function, which is embedded in our live stream. So for those who are in the room, the best way to get there is to go to slido.com and use the hashtag #CatLittle to ask a question. Have you been a hashtag before?
Never. You normally get kittens if you put my name into any Google tool.
And when you ask a question, if you wouldn't mind saying who you are and what organisation you're from, and then if you see a question on Slido that you like, please uprate it rather than asking a very similar but slightly different question, so that I can get to as many of those as possible. So with that, I'm going to kick off. I'm going to hand over to Kat, who's going to just say a few words to start the event. Then we're going to do some Q&A from the stage, and then we'll come to questions. Thanks. Thanks, Kat.
Great, thank you. Well, look, first off, I'll try and be brief, and I tried to condense all of the things that we're thinking about into a shorter speech as possible, but just bear with me, because there's a lot to talk about. When I started this role back in April, the IFG very kindly wrote an article about just how challenging my job was going to be.
We tend to do that.
So it is brilliant to be back here 8 months in to set out how I'm rising to those challenges, and you can be the judge of how well I'm doing it. But as Hannah said, it's an exciting week, but I also think it's a really exciting time to be a civil servant, to be a public servant, and also to be in the Cabinet Office, and especially with the announcement of Sir Chris Wormold as our new Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service. And I've been very fortunate to work very closely with Chris in all of my roles in government, and very much look forward to working with him in the coming years. But lots and lots has changed since I took on this role. So we've got a new government, we have a new way of working through the missions and through service-driven systems leadership. And we are embarking on our approach to the spending review, which, as many of you will have seen, is due to take place by the summer next year. So it won't surprise you with my background that I'm also very, very focused on how we make the most of that opportunity and how we make sure that we are delivering better outcomes more efficiently, more effectively, and more productively. So I thought I should share with you just a few of my priorities against that backdrop of change. And I think it's really important that we get the balance right between continuous improvement and long-term reform, because we're really successful when we keep change moving and we keep practical things getting better, as well as when we think big. And we need to prioritise the common cross-cutting things that we need to deliver. And I also have an important role, which is once we've got a plan, try and stick to the plan, because tenacity really makes a difference. We also need to recognise in the civil service that we are around 120 individual employers. And so whilst the centre of government can set out the strategy, the direction, can cohere how all of that comes together, we've also got to make sure that as individual organisations and employers, we're making the decisions that work best for our businesses, organisations and people. So reform of the civil service works at its best when we collectively agree priorities, We keep them focused on a small number of things, and we empower departments to deliver on the ground. So it is also clear to me that whilst we've delivered a lot of change, we have also not transformed quickly enough to meet the requirements of the UK economy and society today. And that's because there are the same issues that come up time and time again. And we know that sometimes some of these issues hinder our progress despite our best efforts. And I'm talking about things like churn, technological innovation and keeping pace of the use of tech in what we do, using specialists in a really focused way to deliver, the inconsistency of reward, and there's so much more. There are common themes that come up and have done for many years now. So we've also got to look at why have we not been able to tackle some of those common challenges and what can we learn. We also know that our stakeholders find government overly bureaucratic and complex, that we're often slow to lock into gear and to get things done. And I have to say, these are all issues that the IFG have very helpfully shared your insights and recommendations on. And I really believe that that constructive challenge from outside the civil service continues to be incredibly important. So in July, the government committed to publishing a strategic plan for a more efficient and effective civil service. And for me, a really, really key part of that is how we harness the skills and the experience of the near 500,000 people that work within the civil service, and how do we build that pride and professionalism to serve and deliver for the public in everything that we do. And so as part of the work that we've been doing since July, we've been working with lots of our stakeholders to look at what the shared purpose of the civil service should be. And the common themes are, you want the civil service to deliver high quality advice and services that are centred around the public. We need to develop our people to be the best that they can be, to attract the talent that we need, to live our shared values of honesty, integrity, impartiality and objectivity. And you'll hear a very common theme of pride. And as we start to go through our people survey results, people want to restore that sense of pride in public service and the civil service. And we also need to set ourselves up for long-term success. And we talk a lot about being more strategic. So 4 big things that we now need to focus our plan around. The first is our people, putting them at the heart of everything that we do. We must tackle the deficit of specialist skills that we know we have, especially in technology, data and science. We have got to look at our reward model, and I say reward very specifically. It's not just about pay. It's about how we reward, recognise and celebrate our people as much as hard remuneration, but pay obviously is a big theme. And we also need to look at our operating model and the structures and the processes that enable the civil service to operate at its best. And I can't promise to tackle all of those things in one go, but we are looking at them very, very seriously. Hannah and colleagues at the IFG, I hope will be pleased to know that we have committed to publish our first civil service strategic workforce plan. And that work is underway and will go alongside the spending review. And we have got to look at our culture and our leadership and skills, especially as we learn from inquiries and we implement the duty of candour. We know that performance-led organisations with real purpose are high-performing organisations. And I think if we can get that combination of skills, people, pride, professionalism, and a sense of duty across everything that we do, we go a very, very long way to making the civil service a better organisation. Second, I want to talk about what some people might see as a bit dry, but the structures and the processes and what we would describe as the operating model of the civil service. It really, really matters. And if you think about how the civil service has grown over time, quite a lot of it's been quite organic. And in my experience, organisations that have focus, they know how they're organised, they're clear about how we get things done around here, they are organisations that succeed. And it's because you have clarity of accountability and who does what. So we really need to look at our operating model and, dare I say, have one. We need to look at the evolution of functions and professions. We have come a very, very long way, but it's now time to look at how we take it to the next level. And we need to look at how the centre of government can be a really effective systems leader. Thirdly, we continue to embrace digital and data, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this. We've delivered a lot. We've got some brilliant programmes like One Login and the Top 75, but we have got to go so much further. And innovation and how you use technology has got to be at the heart of what we do. I personally believe that we've got a lot of technology available now that we're simply not exploiting to deliver the services that we are responsible for, and we need to do more to take off-the-shelf technology to deliver. We need better tools for our staff to do their roles effectively. And I know everyone's very excited about AI. I am super excited about AI, and it's big, but it's not everything. And we need to utilise the full suite of digital and technological tools that we've got available to us, and to do it in a really sustainable way. Finally, a big theme is place. We are a UK-wide civil service, and we've made huge progress relocating outside of London. And we've now got to capitalise on that local presence. We've done a lot on property and hubs and building more presence across the UK, but really we've now got to say, how do we use policy and delivery to have an impact on the communities that we serve in real time, and to shorten the connections between national state strategy and the local communities who we serve day to day. And we've got to make sure that the civil service has sustainable career paths outside of London as well. We know that we've struggled to attract senior leadership to all of our locations outside of London, and we need to double down on our efforts. Finally, I should say a little bit about the Cabinet Office itself, and especially given the excellent Commission report from the IFG on the centre of government. And I think actually the term the centre of government is quite an interesting thing in itself. So what do you really mean by it? Well, I always mean it as the combination of the Cabinet Office and the Treasury working together to ensure that we lead and enable state-level strategy, and that we jointly set the conditions for the state to succeed. And of course, number 10 is right at the heart of this within the Cabinet Office. And I think there are many insights and issues which the Commission raised which absolutely ring true. And so I'm working on how the Cabinet Office becomes an even more strategic and high-performing department. How do we work even more closely with our friends and colleagues at the Treasury? We are the ultimate systems leader, so we have got to be focused on the things that only the Cabinet Office can do, and we should stop doing the things that can be done more effectively either at arm's length or elsewhere. And I think the centre of government collectively has got to really get the balance right between when we direct and control and when we enable and facilitate. And how you apply that balance to different issues is obviously different, but I think there have been in the past times where we have directed and tried to control more than we have empowered and facilitated success. We've got a lot of change underway in the Cabinet Office, so I'm currently overseeing 5 machinery of government changes. We've established the new Mission Delivery Unit. We welcome teams back to the heart of government on union and EU relations. And I really must take this opportunity to credit all of the teams who have been at the heart of government dealing with so much change, because time and time again we prove that we can deliver and that we rise to the challenge and the expectations that government places on us. So in conclusion, I think the IFG have been right on a lot of the things and a lot of the recommendations that you provided to us over time. Things like building a long-term workforce plan, being more open to external challenge, bringing in more expertise, being more transparent. That's why I'm here today. I think it's important that the civil service does talk about how we're leading change. And I don't know all of the answers. I don't think anyone really does. I'm sure Sir Chris Wormold has many good ideas for us to take forward. But I'm very, very happy to come back and talk to you as we develop more detailed plans for the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kat. I just want to reiterate, because it's a departure from how we normally do things, that even if you're in the room, you need to submit any questions you have for Kat via Slido. So just make sure everyone's clocked that. So we have to start, of course, with the new Cabinet Secretary, seeing that's the news of the day, I'm afraid. Sir Chris Wormold has a range of experience throughout lots of different departments in Whitehall. How Do you anticipate working with him and your role as COO fitting with his as Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I'm sure you'll forgive me that I haven't had a detailed conversation since the announcement, but as you say, Sir Chris Wormald is a very, very experienced colleague and someone who I've worked with very closely in lots of different roles. And I expect to work really, really closely. Obviously, as the head of the civil service, he will set the strategy and the direction for reform of both the civil service and the centre of government. And he will be pivotal in taking forward mission delivery and the plan for change as announced later this week. So my job, as I see it, is to deliver and to implement the civil service reform plan day to day. And I'm also, as the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary, responsible for making sure that the CabSec gets the resources, the people, the skills to discharge their vital responsibilities. So I'm very sure, having spoken to Chris about lots of these themes over the years, that we'll work very closely together. And I think have very complementary skill sets and backgrounds and expertise.
So you've very kindly mentioned our Commission on the Centre of Government, which we published earlier in the year. And one of our key conclusions, having spoken to lots of different people, was that the job of Cabinet Secretary has grown to a point where it's no longer really doable by a single person, that the skill set that anyone would require to be both head of the civil service and Cabinet Secretary supporting the Prime Minister and the Cabinet is sort of an impossible role now. Obviously, that's not the choice the government made in advertising the role. So why were we wrong?
Now, I'd never say that the IFG were ever wrong. So, look, I mean, you're right, the Cabinet Secretary role is big. It's a big, important job, and it's broken down into several components. You know, you're the Prime Minister's lead advisor on national security, economic and domestic affairs. You have huge constitutional responsibilities. You're the head of the civil service. It's a very broad-ranging job, and every Cabinet Secretary discharges that role very differently. But, you know, like all things in life, you've also got to have a brilliant team around the Cabinet Secretary with different skills, different backgrounds, and clear delegations, so that day to day the Cabinet Secretary can bring it all together and be at that strategic level. And so you will have seen, you know, we've got a new National Security Advisor. We're currently recruiting for a second Permanent Secretary for the EU relationship part of our work. And we've also got Clara Simpson as the second Permanent Secretary for missions. So we are building a top team who will support that Cabinet Secretary, well, now we know Chris, and alongside all of the wonderful leaders across the whole of the civil service and the public sector. So I'm confident that it's a doable job, but it all comes down to how you discharge those responsibilities in practice. Indeed.
Another thing you mentioned, which is a key conclusion from the Centre Commission, was about the importance of the civil service needing external pressure to help maintain that momentum behind reform. We had various ideas about how you might achieve that, including a civil service board. Do you agree that that sort of external pressure is important? And do you feel that pressure yourself? And to the extent that you do, where does it come from? Where do you think it ought to be coming from?
Yeah, well, I fundamentally, passionately believe in accountability and transparency. And I think it's right that the civil service and the whole of the public sector is held to account. You know, we're responsible for huge swathes of economic expenditure. We are an increasing size of the state, so it's really, really important. And I think it really helps in driving reform because, you know, quite often when you are in the system, it's very difficult to kind of get objective and diverse views about how best to change it. So it matters more than ever. And I personally get a lot of external pressure and support. So I think those two things have got to go in hand from, you know, obviously think tanks, academics. We have a lot of partnerships with academic institutions who've really helped us think through some big policy issues. And I think Parliament and the public play a really critical role. So I'm at my first PACAC on Wednesday this week. I'm really looking forward to having that discussion. I actually am one of those strange people that relish the opportunity to go to Parliament and to be asked questions, because I think it's right that I'm asked difficult questions and held to account through Parliament. But, we could go further. We've used our non-executive directors much more actively. And, I'm really interested in whether we make some further changes under the new Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing what those might be. Another way in which, of course, government benefits from external experiences by civil servants moving in and out, porosity, which is another theme that we've talked about a lot here. And the most popular question I've received so far from an anonymous person on Slido asks about your view of civil servants taking career breaks to work within a consultancy, bank or charity for a couple of years and bringing that experience back, and how the civil service can really make use of that rather than these civil servants feeling that their career is just stalled for however long it is.
Yeah, well, I'm completely biased because I think you probably know I spent now half of my career in the private sector and half of my career in the civil service. And I genuinely believe that having a different experience with different skills and training probably means I've brought a different perspective to some of the things that we do. And I know that's true of lots of people from different backgrounds and different experiences. And I don't think we always harness that to its fullest impact. So I'm very much in favour of more porosity, more secondments, more structured talent management is the way I would see it across the state as a whole. And I'd specifically say it's not a private-public thing. I actually think we need to get much, much better at sharing our talent across the whole of the public sector. And I think it's brilliant that we've recently had Tom Riordan rejoin us working at the centre of government from local government. We've got lots of people who've gone from the civil service into other parts of the public sector. So I think there is a real question about how do we harness that talent and leadership for the state as a whole. Yes, again, something where we have lots of recommendations, but also, have seen some good practice and hope that will be built on. I'm going to take another question from the Slido from Greg Rosen, who says he's really impressed that you mentioned churn up front in your remarks. As you know, this has been undermining civil service effectiveness for decades. What is your plan to solve it and timescale for implementation? Yeah, well, big question. It's a really big question. So, a few thoughts and a few things that we're doing. So firstly, there's good churn and there's bad churn. And I think whenever we look at the question of churn, we assume that turnover is a bad thing. Generally, we sort of see a healthy turnover being around 5 to 10%. But it really matters to look at this locally by business. It's very difficult to make big assumptions across the whole of the civil service. And if I look at my own department, there are some parts of what we do that really benefit from a healthy level of turnover, particularly in our secretariats and some of our project-based teams where we want to encourage expertise coming to the centre on a project basis and then going back to wherever they might have come from or onto different things. And the centre of government, I think, particularly benefits for a slightly different way of operating in a more kind of professional services sort of matrix way. Having said that, we need to look at the drivers of churn. So part of it, I think, is about a lack of pay progression. So quite often people move because it's the only way to get increased salary or reward. So we've incentivised the system to constantly look for the next job. I think sometimes there are certain jobs where you need people to be very, very specialist. So I look at our SRO community and we've been working quite hard on PRAs, pivotal role allowances, to try and incentivise people to stay in charge of major programmes for longer, with some success. But there are certain roles where you just need people to stay for longer. Our SES, so all permanent secretaries are on 5-year contracts. Our SES have a sort of expectation that Directors General will be enrolled for about 4 years. But I think the policy profession's also looking at how do we incentivise people to become domain experts and not just work within one specialist policy area, but perhaps across a number of areas within a common system. So there are lots of things that we can do about it, but we've got to have a look at the underlying rationale, and you've got to have a better understanding of what is good turnover and what's the desirable level of churn that we should have within our businesses locally.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree with that, but I do think that in a lot of areas of the civil service, we've gone way beyond desirable levels of churn. If you look, I mean, we can't access some of the data about churn within departments, but if you look just about the churn between departments and people leaving the civil service, it looks quite worrying.
Yeah, we know from last year's People Survey, for example, that within 12 months, about 20% of people are looking to move to a new role. So that's about a fifth of our workforce is thinking about the next job. Yep. That says quite a lot.
Yeah. I should say, you look at some other civil services internationally and they have the opposite problem. They can't get people to move and they have people stuck in jobs who are not gaining experience elsewhere.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Different problems. You mentioned the need to think about the reward model, and you've just touched on this in terms of churn. And we've got a question from Dave Penman, the General Secretary of the FDA, who is asking, after nearly 2 decades of pay stagnation, reforming reward will be key to recruiting new skills as well as retaining the right people for the challenges ahead. What do you think reform will look like, and when will the work begin?
Yeah. So, and Dave, I should say, to all of our unions, play a really critical role in this. We've got a lot of evidence about what the issues are. We're currently working on a reward strategy for the civil service. And we obviously need to kind of work through that alongside the spending review, given the very tough fiscal constraints that we're operating in. But there's lots of different ways to look. The questions that we need to look at are, what's the balance between pay and pensions? How do we really focus and segment our pay on the skills that we most need to recruit and retain within the civil service? We know which roles have a competitive marketplace with other sectors, so have we gone far enough in developing market-based competitive pay scales? We've obviously done a lot of that in recent years for some of our specialist functions, but do we need to go further? So there are some big questions about how we tackle compression of grades, how we think about the spans and spines. I think it's really difficult to look at pay and reward in isolation. You've got to look at the whole operating model, which is why in a very sort of geeky way, I'm spending a lot of my time on the operating model, because you can't just look at pay and reward without understanding what the benefits and the conditions to change pay would be. So that work is starting, and very keen to engage both with our unions and with other stakeholders to get views. And ultimately, there will be decisions for the government to take, of course.
Absolutely. I'm just going to tuck in a question from Chris Smythe on this one, who says, what do you think of suggestions that civil servants should be paid better, but there should be fewer of them?
So conceptually, it's the sort of obvious sort of trade-off, isn't it? And I think when you're operating within a tight spending envelope for public sector expenditure, we can't just pay everyone more without there being a dividend and without there being a return. And it doesn't always have to be about size. It can also be about productivity. It can be about other savings that we can make. So whilst simplistically that sort of formulation's attractive, I'm not sure it quite reflects the complexity of the issues that we've got to deal with.
Okay, we've focused so far mostly on civil service reform. What does public sector reform mean?
So, quite a lot of what we are doing at the moment is trying to answer that question. And we've actually set up a new public sector reform and efficiency group within the Cabinet Office, not because we think the Cabinet Office has all the answers to that, but because we recognise that we have an important systems role to play in cohering wider public service reform. And so quite a lot of what we're doing is looking at the how, and how do we think about prevention policy, how do we look at greater autonomy to local leadership, lots of questions about how do we really enable success of local systems to operate more effectively. So I don't yet have all the answers to that question, but I think it's a really important one for us to work through. And of course the civil service is sort of a vector for so many parts of wider public service reform. It's very difficult to sort of say, well, central government does this in isolation and reform of the rest of the public sector happens over here. It's all intrinsically joined up. So we do need to reform together.
And I think I noticed from the things you mentioned there that the how the sorts of how things you're mentioning there about sort of autonomy and so on are things that don't cost a lot of money?
They can. They also save a lot of money. But then it's the age-old problem, isn't it, with prevention, is how do you really crystallise the benefit to reinvest? And
on what timescale?
And over what timescale? And I mean, these are the big questions that we will have to work through as part of next steps on policy development and, of course, as part of the spending review. And you can't do all of these things at once. We've got to build on the momentum that's already out there, because I think, we often look at things and assume that prevention policy isn't already happening. It really is in lots of parts of what we do. So I think how we build on that momentum and keep going is also an important part of what we've got to do.
You mentioned missions as a new way of government doing things, including public sector reform. I'm not asking you to preempt anything that might be announced later this week in terms of the plan for change, but tell us about the how of missions. How do you see a missions approach changing the way you do your job?
Yeah. Well, I think the how is absolutely critical, and we should kind of say up front, like, systems leadership is not a new thing to government, and we should recognise that there are lots of barriers to getting systems leadership working effectively. And if we look at some of the challenges for central government in particular, we are set up around our departments, around our unique employers, our processes are set up around age-old institutions. And so we have got to fundamentally change our mindset and our culture. We've got to change our processes to make them much more multilateral. And we've got to really incentivise and performance manage on a cross-cutting basis. And we've tried lots of different reforms in the recent years, which I think we have a lot to learn from. So, when I was in the Treasury, we had the Shared Outcomes Fund, which was all about investing in genuine shared outcomes that you could measure and evaluate and demonstrate tangible reforms on. Under the public value framework, at the last spending review, we had 22, I think it was, might be 23, shared outcomes where we specifically said these are the joint collective outcomes across a number of things that we're doing. And I think missions are really the kind of modern articulation of systems leadership. So we're doing a lot of work on process systems, how we run things, and crucially our leadership. So how do we incentivise the very top of public sector leadership to be passionate about outcomes and working together, and not letting the kind of parochial things that are in our day-to-day lives get in the way of that.
So how does a mission board look different to a cabinet committee? What's different in terms of how it operates?
So our mission boards are obviously cohered entirely around systems, and you have obviously a very, very clear set of prioritised goals within long-term reform. And quite often our cabinet committees, they obviously do a range of strategy to kind of immediate decisions that need to be made, whereas the missions are very much about that long-term ambition. And of course the Prime Minister's talked about a decade of renewal, so getting that balance is a different thing. And we're quite early on in the missions, so we've got our mission board set up, we've got routine prime ministerial stock takes. I think it's probably too early to assess. I think there's a lot of work that we are doing, and obviously very widely trailed. Some of that work coming to fruition later this week, but they're different because they're strategic, they're focused, and they are about long-term tenacity to drive through change in a very singular way, and they are prioritising everything that we do on the lines of missions. So they do feel different.
Well, we look forward to seeing how that works out as they get more embedded. You talked about setting the right incentives for people to work in a more multilateral way. What role will missions play in the spending review? How are you going to incentivise people? And fundamentally, when it comes down to what money you're going to get and how you're going to spend it, what's going to be different about the way that spending review is run now that we have missions?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, a lot of this will be said later in the week. But the spending review will be outcome focused, and it will be very, very focused and prioritised on the outcomes that the government most wants to achieve.
We will look forward to later in the week. What is your vision of what the civil service will look like in 2030?
So I think the civil service will, one, be much more technologically enabled. I think lots of the things that frustrate and create friction in our work will be made better by the use of technology and AI. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's here today. I've got teams using Microsoft Copilot, using AI to help write minutes. It is going to exponentially be a feature of our lives, and I think it will be a feature for the good. I think we'll have much more specialism, and I really would like us to stop using the word generalist in the civil service. I know other permanent secretary colleagues believe in this. Being a civil servant is a profession, and if you look at the ONS statistics, I think from the last quarter, about half of our people can say this is the profession I belong to, and we still have a number of people who just don't say. And I think that's a shame, because we need to see everything we do through the lens of professionalism and skills. I think the way we train people will be very, very different. I think we will have a much more focused core curriculum for everyone in the civil service, and I think we'll have specialist skills being taught in increasing layers of accreditation so that we can see progress in capability. And I hope we'll see more of that being done by civil servants. When I hark back to being a sort of junior accountant, being trained by senior accountants on, what great professional skills look like, and that sort of day-to-day coaching, I feel a very personal responsibility to pass on what I've learned and what I know to the next generation. I think we need to build that in much, much more to what we do day to day in the civil service. It's not just about the kind of formal courses that we go on. And I think, and I hope, that we will see lasting impact in the communities that we serve right across the UK. We have been far too London and South East centric. I think it's quite right that the taxpayer and the public see our services locally, see us working on policy development and having an impact in local communities. So they're just some of the features. Most importantly, I hope that we are delivering services more effectively, more efficiently, more productively, and to the standard and high performance that people would expect.
I think we'd agree with all of that. Just to pick up on your L&D point, and totally agree and see the point about sort of mentoring and training within the civil service. Do you think the current model of learning and development, externally provided learning and development for the civil service, is working well?
So I think there will always be a need for deep specialist training in what we do, and the fact that we use it extensively to provide very technical skills, I think shows that there is good value, and especially since we've brought it all together across the whole of the civil service. You probably know we have kind of economy of scale through trying to do this as one civil service, but we've got to evolve it, and we know where external training works well, and we know where there are gaps. So I really want to see the holistic model of in-house and external support focused on the things where we can maximise effectiveness.
Great. You tucked in a few points from the Cabinet Office at the end of your speech, so I'll just focus in on the Cabinet Office for a little bit. My colleague Alex Thomas has asked a question to say, you agreed with our Centre Commission principle that the Cabinet Office should only do what can only be done at the centre. What has the Cabinet Office stopped doing?
So, it's still quite early days, and if you look at our machinery of government changes, there's quite a lot in there. So we have moved a number of things from the Cabinet Office, and these are wonderful friends and colleagues who we're currently working with for a smooth transition. So the Office of Veterans Affairs, for example, has moved to the Ministry of Defence. I think the question about what we stop is still one that we need to work through, and it's because we've only just had a spending review for phase 1. We're in the middle of business planning. we can't continue adding responsibilities and new things to what government does. We have got to really, really prioritise and stop some things. So, you know, that's the process that we are currently working through, and I'm sure I'll be able to say more this time next year.
I think we're definitely going to have you back to follow up on some of these things. You said, as you reminded us in your speech, you've been in post now for 6 months. You came in from working in other departments, the MOD and so on. What surprised you when you moved into the Cabinet Office, good and bad, having observed the centre from the outside and then coming into it at that point?
So I think the first thing is I knew how much the Cabinet Office had been through. You know, from a very basic kind of human perspective, the Cabinet Office has been right at the heart of lots of recent events and changes, but I perhaps underestimated just how that really shapes the culture and how people feel. So, you know, our people survey results a couple of years ago plummeted and are only just now on an improving trajectory, and that's because it takes time for people to kind of absorb change and to kind of work through what that means for them personally and organisationally. So I think I probably underestimated just how much of that change has really affected people and therefore the organisation, because that's all we really are at the end of the day. I think comparing and contrasting with the Treasury, like they're both the kind of combined centre of government, but very, very different. And it's hard to sort of put into kind of practical things, but I think you know, the Treasury is a much smaller organisation. It's much more focused and is very, very disciplined about what it does and what it doesn't do. And I think, you know, coming to the Cabinet Office and looking at the breadth of things that we are responsible for. My first few weeks, I kept discovering things, exciting things that we were doing, but I hadn't quite appreciated until I was actually in the job. And maybe that's part of the challenge, is because we are everything else. It means that we are often the place where things that need to be done at the centre but don't fit within the Treasury end up. And that's obviously right and proper, because it means it's important to the centre of government, but it means that we're constantly changing. And that can be hard to manage that level of change.
Do you think there's a way to give the Cabinet Office more clarity of purpose, given that we completely recognise, and it was what we heard again and again during the Centre Commission, this sort of, it makes sense to have it at the centre, but when you put it all together, it's difficult to make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the parts matter when you are at the centre of government. So I think there are ways to do it, and we're currently working through some of the big questions. So, you know, what must always be done by the Cabinet Office? There are certain things that just always have to be done at the centre of government, you know, collective agreement, the secretariating, state strategy, how we run the civil service. You know, if you have the head of the civil service with the Cabinet Secretary in the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office has got to run the civil service effectively. So there are certain things that you have always got to do at the centre of government. And I think we can be clearer about what is the kind of irreducible core and what are the things that you can choose to do. So we're currently kind of thinking about those questions.
Got a question that's come in online. It's very popular, but from an anonymous person. Does long-term success mean less reliance on external consultancies? One could argue that the reliance on these consultancies is an admission of the lack of internal skills and experience to deliver change.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's right, in that we are using a lot of consultants to help us with skills gaps, and quite often it's where we can't build skills quickly, yet things need to be done quickly, and so we do turn to consultants to plug that gap. I think what's challenging is where we are not then in parallel building those skills, or where we're using external consultants to fulfil capacity which we may not have within the civil service, but we do have the skills. So I think quite rightly we are looking at reducing our reliance on consultancy. As you know, the government has set a target for us to reduce consultancy spend by £550 million this year and more next year as well. But the key to it is we've got to build skills in-house, and we've got to take a long-term view. And I should also say there will always be a need for some form of professional service and consultancy input to what we do. And it goes back to what we were saying about constructive challenge, different skills, experiences and background. It's focusing it in the right way.
So in terms of those skills where you're talking about things which are currently being done, it's not just about capacity, but there are things which are skills you'd like to have in the civil service, but you're having to go out for, but you'd like to build them internally. Can you identify any of those?
Yeah, I mean, the big ones are technology and data science, and actually science more broadly. Like we know, particularly for digital skills, we are operating in a very, very competitive market, and it's probably the area that we have the most vacancies at any one time. So that's a particular area of focus between us and DSIT.
Because now we have DSIT as the digital centre of government, so how is that affecting the Cabinet Office's role in kind of pushing adoption of technology across government?
Yeah, well, technology will always be at the heart of everything that we do in government, and so as an enabler, the Cabinet Office will always be pushing to ensure that technology, digital and data is at the heart of strategy and delivery. And in practice, a lot of the ways of working with digital teams and technology teams across government hasn't changed. What I think has been very positive is the fact that we've brought policy and delivery together in DSIT, and that's already starting to have, I think, a good impact both on people and the focus that we've got. But yeah, so it's changed in terms of people report into a different department, but in terms of teamwork and ways of working day to day, it's still very integrated.
Great. I'm afraid I'm just going to take some slightly disparate questions now that are coming through online. So a few quick fire for you. Sylvia DePaul says the IFG on the 18th of November published an article on the promotion of diversity and inclusion. Thanks for reading that, Sylvia. She asks, how do you think the 60% in-office attendance will help reach different demographics and attract the best people?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, on your excellent article on diversity and inclusion, like we can never be complacent, and we have got to deliver on the D&I strategy, and I really believe that it's imperative for the success of what we do in terms of outcomes and performance. The 60% principle that we have set out, I think is important to our ways of working, and it's important because we know that we need to get a balance between being together and working in multidisciplinary teams and getting the best out of people. And we also need to get the best out of when people aren't in the office and are able to make the most of being at home or wherever they might be. There's lots of good reasons for why people are more productive in that setting. So do I think it has a detrimental impact on diversity and inclusion? I think from an inclusion perspective, there are huge benefits for bringing people together. We've got to work in a much more hybrid way and to make the most of it. I mean, we've all been on Teams calls where if you're on the line desperately trying to get your point across to people in the room, the art to chairing a hybrid meeting is very different to an all-in-person meeting. So we've got to make those working practices work more effectively to be inclusive, but I really passionately believe that it's the right way for the modern world. And I think, from a broader kind of diversity perspective, there'll be lots of both positive things that we can do for inclusion and for attracting different people. And a lot of people say, I want to be in the office and I want to be with people I can learn from.
And I think the current D&I strategy runs to 2025, so do you have plans beyond that?
We will be refreshing the D&I strategy, and we are starting that work now.
Very good. We have a popular anonymous question. Do you think the civil service success profile is effective in recruiting talented civil servants? If not, do you have any plans to upgrade or change it?
Yeah, so we implemented the success profile, I think, 3-ish years ago. We get lots of feedback about it, and it's quite varied feedback in that some people love it and find success profiles really helpful for consistency and for making sure that we approach recruitment in a much more fair and open way. And there are some bits of feedback where people really struggle to engage with it. So the thing I care about is, does it drive quality of outcome? And is it helping us to meet our recruitment objectives? And I think on the whole, it is. But, we keep these things under constant review, and we will do in future.
I have another anonymous question. Many other G7 countries put aspects of the civil service roles, responsibilities and performance on a statutory basis. Maybe this is from an IFG person. Given the size of the state and its many different units, should the UK now have its own civil service legislation?
Well, I think that is very much a matter for the government.
Could you see some benefits from it yourself?
I think you've got to look at what would it drive differently in terms of outcomes. And whenever you put something on a kind of legislative footing, there are both positive things in terms of transparency and accountability and certainty, but there are also unintended consequences that you've got to work through. It makes it much more inflexible to change and to adapt to the conditions that you're operating in. So I can see both merits and challenges.
Do you think it was a mistake then to put the civil service values into statute?
No, because I think they are very much at the heart of everything, and your values, and let's face it, they are enduring, very long-term values that have been at the heart of the Civil Service Code for a very, very long time. I think your values are less likely to fluctuate, especially when the civil service and its professionalism are so rooted in who we are and our identity. So I don't think it was wrong to put those in.
So less likely to fluctuate than the accountability that you want civil service to have?
Potentially, yeah. I suppose it depends what you actually legislate for and why. Ultimately, say talking about legislation at top level, I think is quite tricky. I think getting into the guts of, where would the benefits be at a more granular level. I mean, the debate will continue, and it has been continuing for quite a while.
How much time we've got? Okay, I've got time for a couple more questions taken from online. This links back to one I asked you earlier about civil service sort of 2030. A recent IFG inside briefing, this is from someone called Victoria. There's no one called Victoria who works for the IFG, so this can't be a reference. The recent IFG inside briefing spoke about the need for the civil service to prove its role and value to a new government. What are the top selling points and top development areas, in your opinion? What's your elevator pitch for an improved civil service?
Yeah, well, if I look back on the last few months and what we have dealt with, we've risen to some big challenges, whether it's the delivery of the first budget, the King's speech delivered within 9 days of the new government forming. We have seen through quite a period of violent disorder over the summer. We've seen big geopolitical changes, and we've seen further increased conflict in the Middle East. So my main pitch would be the civil service has risen to those challenges, and I think served a new government well in navigating quite a lot of complexity early on in their tenure. And to be even better, we have got to be able to be more long-term, less reactive, much more skilled, simpler to engage with, and to ensure that we keep delivering. Like, performance and delivery is at the heart of what the country needs from us, and we deliver great services every single day, but we've got to continuously improve and demonstrate that we can deliver and rise to the challenge of implementation, as well as react to big circumstances and big events.
So do you think, as a final question from me, what more do you think needs to be done to restore a more self-confident public service ethos, that all those benefits and skills and advantages that the public service brings that you list there, that there can be really a sense within the public service of that value and confidence? Yeah,
well, I think firstly, we need to be able to celebrate our successes and achievements, not in a sort of overly arrogant way, but so that we can learn from each other and share good practice. And I also think we need to get to know each other better. So we've reignited our public service leadership conferences, where we get together the whole of public sector leadership to talk about the missions and the challenges and how we're working together, and just to get to know each other at a service level much more effectively. And I suppose every public servant I know says to me the thing that matters most is getting out of bed and trying to make things better every single day. And you imagine if you could just unleash and join up that energy and that optimism and that service and dedication to our country in a more unified way. Like, I think there's a real opportunity to do that in a much more positive, open, transparent way generally. Otherwise, we spend a lot of time, because we're quite humble, sort of saying, you know, here are all our difficult weaknesses and the things that we've got to fix. We've also got to just recognise there's some brilliant things that we do every single day, and we do it very well.
And what are you personally going to do to unleash that sense?
Well, I'm doing quite a lot already, so partly reigniting our national leadership forums and bringing people collectively together. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of visible leadership across the whole of the civil service, and Simon and I have done a lot of that. But you know, actually getting out and talking on every departmental staff call. I do a lot of travelling to be as visible physically as I can be as well, because that matters. We've got the Civil Service Awards next week, which is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about real achievements, tangible impacts on people's lives and service improvement. So I really hope that we can come together to celebrate and do more of that. And of course, it's the tangible things. My job is to actually operationally make the civil service a better, more efficient, effective set of organisations. So, you know, every week my teams are looking at how do we improve recruitment, how do we keep going on delivery of the people plan, how do we really ensure that we've got the balance right in how we provide advice and support and implement spending control. They're the sorts of things every single day that we've just got to make better.
Great. Well, I should say we really appreciate you coming here and your openness in answering all our questions and those of our audience. Thanks to everyone who's sent in questions on the Slido, for those of you who are here in the room or sending them in online. The live stream of this event will be available to watch later this week on our website and on YouTube. And do check out our website for some other excellent events and reports. I have to inform you, we have set up a last-minute webinar tomorrow between 10 and 11 titled The New Cabinet Secretary, Can Sir Chris Wormald Rewire the British State? So that sounds like must-watch webinar, and that will be many of my IFG colleagues together with Sir David Liddington. So please do register to watch that on our website. But before we get to that, please do join me in thanking Kat for really illuminating our hour of questions.